Hello, everybody. My name's Bill McKibben, and I'm very glad to get to talk to you today. Let me tell you a tiny bit about my background, just so you'll know where I'm coming from. I wrote the first book about climate change for a general audience 32 years ago when I was 28 years old. If you do the math correctly, you'll realize I'm now at the advanced age of 60. So I've been working on the problem of climate change as long as it's been a public problem and for most of my life. And one of the things I've done in the years since, beyond writing, is found a group called 350.org that was the first iteration of a global climate movement. And we've taken on a lot of fights, tried to, succeeded in stopping huge pipelines and other projects, launched this massive movement to get people to sell their stock in fossil fuel companies and so on. So I both write about and am an activist in this world. So let me tell you, I think it might be most useful for me to give you just some sense of where we are right now and then where the pressure points might be that it would be useful to think about pushing on hard with whatever skills you have. Where we are right now is in a race, and we are behind in that race, it must be said. The planet is warming because humans are continuing to burn lots of coal and gas and oil primarily, and hence emit carbon into the atmosphere. And as that carbon accumulates in the atmosphere, its molecular structure traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. So far, human beings have raised the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree Celsius. That doesn't sound like that much, but it turns out that it's a lot. You can measure it in other units. If the heat equivalent, the extra heat that we trap in the atmosphere each day because of all these carbon emissions, each day is equivalent to about the heat of 400,000 Hiroshima-sized nuclear explosions. And that's been enough heat to melt most of the summer sea ice in the Arctic. It's rapidly raising the level of the ocean around the world. It's doing things like killing off coral reefs all over the place. It's changed the way that water moves around the planet because warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That's why you get more evaporation in dry areas, and that leads to drought and hence to huge forest fires like the ones we've seen. Once that water is up in the air, it comes down pretty quickly, and it comes down in deluge and flood. And we see far more flooding on our planet than we've ever seen before. So we're in the first stages of a crisis. That's what happens when you raise the temperature of the planet 1 degree. We're on a path at the moment, if we keep doing what we're doing now, to raise the temperature of the planet 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. And if we do that, we cannot have civilizations like the ones that we're used to. The damage would just be too great. The fight now is to see, can we hold that increase in temperature to 2 degrees or maybe less? And if we can, it will not be a perfect world. It will be a difficult world with worse problems than we're facing now. But we may be able to survive it as civilizations. That's the most important fight or race that we've ever been in. And finally, human beings are stepping up and starting to join that race, starting to try and move our economies and our governments at the pace that they need to go. We've seen a few beginning signs of that. The world came together to sign the Paris Climate Accords 5 years ago. Now, for instance, the new government in America is taking stronger steps to try and at least meet the commitments that it made in Paris. And other governments around the world are doing somewhat the same thing. Here's the thing that's making it easier to do that. Engineers have done a very good job, and the price of solar power and wind power has fallen extraordinarily fast and extraordinarily far. So the sun and the wind are all of a sudden the cheapest way to generate electricity on this planet. And we can increasingly understand that we can use electricity to do most of the things we need to do, to power vehicles, to heat and cool homes, obviously to provide light or communications or things like that. So our job is to move very quickly to provide renewable energy electricity to do the work that humans need doing. We need to become more efficient in doing that work too, so that we use less energy, and we probably need to do less things. For instance, we don't need to be jumping on airplanes constantly to travel all over the world just to find some place that's a little warmer than the place we are now. Travel should be reserved for things that are more serious than that. But that's the good news. That's the thing that's helping us, that's spurring us along. What's holding us back in this race? What anchor is tied around our waist that makes it hard to run? That anchor is called the fossil fuel industry, the coal and oil and gas industry, and the people who work in it. They're unwilling to change their business model, at least at anything like the speed we need them to. They want to keep trying to do what they've been doing for 200 years, for another 10 or 20 or 30 years. And if they're allowed to, then they'll manage to break the planet's climate system. So part of our job is to weaken their ability to do that. There are many ways to do that. Some of the most important involve, and I hope that you'll investigate these and figure out how you can help, involve figuring out how to cut off the supply of money to the fossil fuel industry. One way we do this is what's called the divestment movement that some of us started about a decade ago. And it asks institutions to sell their shares in coal and oil and gas companies in order to make it harder for them to raise capital, in order to reduce their political power too. This has been a very successful movement. We're at about $15 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have taken this action. Some of them include big universities with their endowments. So Oxford and Cambridge, or the University of California system, or Brown and Cornell and Columbia and the Ivy Leagues, or many of our most important Catholic schools that are following the lead of Pope Francis, who's been a big advocate for climate action. There are big pension funds like New York City or New York State. There are entire countries like Ireland that have divested all their public accounts, on and on and on. It would be really useful to keep building momentum in this movement so that more and more and more places are divesting all the time. And there are hundreds and hundreds of campaigns that you can join depending where you are to put pressure here. It's very, very useful, especially, I think, on colleges and universities, which we look to for leadership in these things. There's also increasingly an effort to get big financial institutions, banks, asset managers, insurance companies, to stop providing money to the fossil fuel industry. The banks have loaned just one bank alone, JP Morgan Chase, has loaned more than $250 billion to the fossil fuel industry since the Paris Climate Accords were signed. They've been sabotaging our efforts to do anything about climate. So people are trying hard to get them to change their ways. I'll tell you that about a year ago, right before the pandemic, I got arrested in the lobby of the Chase Bank branch nearest the Capitol in the U.S. in order to start building pressure on them. And that campaign, even with the pandemic, has been somewhat effective. Chase announced earlier this year that their lending henceforth would try to comply with the Paris Agreement. That's a pretty vague promise. We don't know what it means. It'll take a lot more activism, but it's a sign that people pushing hard to do things like threaten to withdraw their bank accounts or to cut up their credit cards from Chase and Wells Fargo and Bank of America and Barclays and the other big fossil fuel lenders and replace them with credit cards or bank accounts at often smaller, more climate friendly and usually human rights friendly banks and investment managers is a really important idea. You can find out a lot more about this at a website called Stop the Money Pipeline, because that's the coalition that's come together to try and do this work. So there are a lot of pressure points that we can use to try and weaken the ability of the fossil fuel industry to fight off the change that we need. There's also, of course, political work to be done, election campaigns, getting the right people in office, and so on is very important. None of it's easy, but all of it's doable. And over the last 10 years, this movement has risen around the world that really, really gets things done. Some of that movement is organizations like 350.org that I helped found, or Extinction Rebellion, or the Sunrise Movement, or the magnificent Fridays for the Future campaign that grew out of the school strikes from great leaders like Greta Thunberg and the 10,000 other Greta Thunbergs around the planet and their 10 million followers. Young people are really at the absolute forefront of this effort at this point, and that's very good to see because young people, of course, are going to have to deal with the very worst of this. I'll be dead before climate change is at its absolute worst, but people who are in high school or college now will be in the absolute prime of their careers, except that if we don't get this under control, their career will consist of being emergency responders, trying somehow to hold off this ever-increasing damage. We do not want that. We want a world that works more fairly for everyone, and we want a world that has some hope of sustaining the civilizations that people before us have built. That's why this work seems so urgent and so important, and why I'm so grateful to you for taking a lead in helping get it done. It'll take every skill that you have in order to stand up to the power of vested interest and the power of inertia. And I'm confident that you're capable of it, and that all of us working together will manage to make very real change very fast. Fast is important because global warming is a time test. If we do not solve it soon, we do not solve it. No one has a plan for refreezing the Arctic once it's melted. So let's get on it, and let's get on it very, very fast. Thank you enormously for being part of the solution.